hello, it's going to work today because I'm at work and I have my visualizer and I'm not relying on an iPad which basically doesn't work. No, it's not the iPad's fault. It's actually my fault because I didn't press enable microphone because I forgot. So, whatever. I'm going to finish off the social impact of war today. You might have watched my weird silent version, but if you haven't, I don't blame you because it would have made no sense probably because a lot of the stuff I was writing down was probably a load of waffle if you didn't have my verbal waffle over the top of it. So, what we looked at last lesson was class tensions, things like conscription being, in theory, a social leveller, but in reality, really not being a social leveller. And we looked at food and rationing and stuff like that. Today, we're going to have a look at health, we're going to look at the impact of war on women, and we're going to have a look at the impact of war on education, and also crime, everyone's favourite thing. Cheeky bit of crime, cheeky bit of ration book exploitation, and illicit consumption of illegal salmon and stuff like that. So, where we'll start then is the establishment of something called the EMS, so the Emergency Medical Service. This is established in 1939, so it's established right at the beginning of the war. And part of what the EMS does is some doctors and nurses are now on government payroll. So some doctors and nurses are now paid a salary by the government. And this salary is often at a higher rate than what they would have had access to in private medicine. The Emergency Medical Service is also responsible for hospitals. So it takes control of what you call a voluntary hospital, which is basically like a free hospital where the poor can go and get treated. And we also have the building of hospitals in locations that you wouldn't think are ideal. So it might be like a disused warehouse, for example, or an old factory. So as much as these buildings might not be ideal because they're freezing cold or they don't have decent electric provision or anything like that, they're necessary because of the sheer amount of people that are requiring medical care during the Second World War. And what's interesting about the EMS is it starts people's thought process about the role of the state in medical provision and whether the state is going to have a direct involvement in medical provision even after the end of the war. So it gets people to start thinking about state role in medicine. We also have the introduction of free vaccination campaigns under the EMS. So one of the massive diseases that is plaguing young people is called diphtheria. And I wouldn't advise Googling pictures of diphtheria because it is a bit horrible, but it's basically like a growth at the back of your throat. And I want you to think really carefully about why the government is placing a lot of emphasis on children. So why is the government giving free vaccinations for young people? Why is the government evacuating young people? Why are they focusing on children and not focusing on, for example, middle-aged men? Why is the government so interested in maintaining the health of the young population and potentially not ignoring, but not placing as much attention on sort of like the middle-aged working classes, for example? What is it about children that the government is interested in? So one of the reasons, or one of the consequences rather, of things like the EMS and the free vaccination campaigns is people are a lot healthier during war. So we actually have a healthier population between 1939 and 45 than we do pre-war. And interestingly, things like infant mortality decrease. So between 1939 and 1945, infant mortality rates have fallen 20%, which means in those 6 years, 20% less babies are dying before the age of 1. And this is because there is better pediatric medicine. Remember, pediatric is like children. So infant mortality is falling. The other thing that's falling is maternal mortality, so women who are dying in childbirth or immediately afterwards. So by 1952, so 7 years after the Second World War and 4 years after the introduction of the NHS, you've got 69 deaths per 100,000 births per year. Now, that might sound quite high, which I suppose it is, because any death during childbirth is too many deaths. But in the 1920s, 1930s, you're looking at several hundred women dying in childbirth per every 100,000 births. So there's actually a significant improvement in pre- and postnatal care. So we have a healthier population. Less children are dying, less women are dying in childbirth, less people are malnourished, we've got less conditions like rickets. So because children actually have access to healthier foods, vegetables, vitamins, etc., you've got less malnutrition and diseases related to malnutrition like rickets. Rickets affects your joints, it gives you what's called bowed legs. Yeah, so part of our study of the NHS and the creation of the welfare state by the Labour government will involve studying something called the Beveridge Report in a lot of detail. What the Beveridge Report is a report, obviously, written by a guy called William Beveridge, who is not a Labour MP, he is a Liberal. And you will really get a sense of that when we actually look at what he's advocating in the Beveridge Report, specifically about things like national insurance and something called national assistance, which is introduced at the sort of very end of the 1940s. He's very keen on the ideas of like the deserving and undeserving poor. So his idea is that you sort of have to earn welfare and sort of benefit support, which is a very liberal idea because it's the ideas about like self-responsibility and stuff like that. Anyway, we'll look at that in more detail when we actually get to the creation of the NHS in a couple of weeks' time. But the main part of the Beveridge Report that you need to have an understanding of is the identification of what he calls the 5 giants or the 5 evils of society. These are the things that need to be dealt with in order for society to function properly and everyone to have a decent standard of living and decent quality of life, basically. So, one of the evils is want, which is to do with poverty. You've got idleness, which is unemployment. Disease is straightforward, obviously it's disease. Squalor is to do with living conditions. If you live in squalor, it means you live in absolutely appalling conditions with things like damp and mould, and your house is subsiding, which means it's basically like collapsing sideways. So want, idleness, disease, squalor, and ignorance. And ignorance is basically him saying that education is not good enough in the country, and there are rates of literacy in the country that are too low. So what Beveridge is saying is that in order for society to move on and truly modernise, it is these 5 giants that need to be dealt with and destroyed. In order for these 5 giants to be dealt with and destroyed, Beveridge argues that the state has a responsibility for its people from the cradle to the grave. This is a motto, if you like, which is maintained by the NHS after its creation in July 1948. And it basically is saying from the moment of birth till the moment of death, you need to be looked after by the state. If you can't look after yourself, basically. So that's where we see the introduction of things like national assistance, which is like sort of like an early precursor of the proper benefit system and stuff like that. Again, we'll look at this in a lot more detail when we actually get to the creation of the NHS. As you can imagine, the Beveridge report gets significant public support, but it also gets cross-party support, which basically means that people on all sides of the political spectrum, Liberal, Labour, Conservative, support the Beveridge report in some sort of way. It's very likely that if the Conservatives had won the 1945 election and had stayed in government post-war, they would have introduced a healthcare system or a welfare system that was similar to what Labour introduced. So the Beveridge report is incredibly influential, and it gets people to start thinking about state responsibility for people's welfare. And what we need to think about is the NHS, is the Labour Party welfare state socialism? Because that's what this is implying. That's what, you know, if you do a basic reading of the Beveridge report, you're like, well, this is socialism. We need to think about, is the welfare system as designed by Labour, by the time they get out of power in 1951, have they introduced socialised medicine to Britain? And that is what we will talk about in a couple of weeks. So, moving on then, we're going to have a think about the role of women in, oh gosh, I need to drop my phone then, in British society during the Second World War. So, Summerfield is a historian of women's contributions to the Second World War, and she argues, just trying to find a highlighter, I've got literally hundreds in front of me and I have weird decision paralysis about which one to pick. And she argues this. As men moved into wartime military roles at the Western Front or Eastern Front or just behind, women were required to do the work previously reserved for men. So this is incredibly similar to World War I, and it's things like industry, munitions, transport, etc., etc. So it's taking on these traditionally male fields of employment. So in theory, this is breaking gender stereotypes. And a lot of people will have an overly simplified view of the Second World War in the same way that they have an overly simplified view of the First World War. And they'll argue that just because women were working in munitions and transport and industry, that means that the glass ceiling had been shattered, everything was great, women were amazing, and women were treated exactly the same as men. Obviously, that's a load of hogwash. I'm not going to swear on a pre-record. That's obviously not true. Because what ends up happening is, since the new roles for men were more highly valued than those acquired by women, the dynamic of gender subordination was not properly altered. So what that means is these new roles that men are going into, so, oh no, what's happened there? Oh my God, my pen, what's happened? I, for some reason, can't use my own pen. Because these roles, predominantly in the military, are seen as more socially valuable. And what I mean by that is they have more status, or they are more respected. Because these jobs are more socially valuable, viewed as more socially valuable, the jobs that women are now doing, which historically have been done by men, are not seen as socially valuable. So the jobs that men used to do are now perceived as women's work, which, as you'll see in a second, justifies employers not paying women a fair wage. What else is new? I wish I could say I was joking. I'm not joking. So in terms of the conscription of women then, one slight change that we can observe during the war is that initially married women with young children are not conscripted into wartime industry or wartime labour. So this highlights how even during times of crisis, traditional gender roles are like the government tries to uphold and maintain traditional gender expectations. So the war does not initially radically alter the social status of women. Why am I getting so many texts? Probably something really boring. What is it? Oh, that's hilarious. My friend has got a speeding thingy because they were doing 30 miles an hour in a 20 miles an hour zone. How hilarious. Anyway, so married women with young children were initially not conscripted into the war effort because the government is desperately trying to uphold traditional gender expectations. However, by 1943, there are acute labour shortages across the country because more and more men are off fighting. So they need women to fill the gaps, basically. So what we see by 1944 is 900,000 married women working in industry. So we see 900,000 married women working in wartime industry, contributing to the war effort. However, this is not hugely radical. This is not a massive proportion of married women in the UK. It's less than 1 million. So it's still not enough to argue that there is radical shifting in like gender expectations. Which is exactly the same as the situation in the First World War. And we see the fact that it's not enough to argue that there's radical shifts in the fact that women are paid less than half of men. So the average woman's wage is £2 4 shillings and 2 pence. The average man's wage is £4 19 shillings and 3 pence. So women are earning less than half for very similar work, or indeed the same work. And the reason that men's average wage seems to be higher is obviously partly because of misogyny and sexism, but also because I don't know how to word this. They're doing the more respectable or high status jobs. Because what begins to happen is women start doing certain jobs in industry and transport and munitions construction and textiles and stuff like that. And then those jobs get way less respect and status and pay, basically. And the jobs that men are doing are seen as more worthy simply because they're being done by men. And what's interesting is these are the wage statistics for 1941. But what had been done in 1940 is an agreement between industry leaders and the government that women would be allowed to progress to men's pay rates if they could demonstrate that they were sort of fulfilling the job in the same way that a man would be. However, the argument that we have that this is not successful is 75% of women in engineering are paid less than men. for the same job. This, combined with the fact that trade unions are still hostile to women, proves that there is no radical shift in gender roles. Society is still incredibly socially conservative. Trade unions are still hostile to women, very, very similar to how they'd been in the First World War. Now, in terms of education then, there are no teachers because they're all off fighting in the war. So there's a teacher shortage because of conscription. So either into the army, or if you've got female teachers, especially single young female teachers, they'd be conscripted into industry because education is not a priority. So the consequence of that is you'd have huge class sizes, and I'm talking like 60 kids per teacher. And you'd also have non-specialists teaching super important subjects, like the most basic aspects of education, like mathematics, numeracy, reading, comprehension, that kind of stuff. So what ends up happening is the quality of education decreases during the Second World War until the passage of the Education Act. But that happens right at the end of the Second World War, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other sort of failure of pre-war education is a lot of working class conscripts are illiterate. Basically, they come to the army, they're given a bunch of instructions or an assignment, and they can't blooming read it. So they can't read or write. That's a huge problem, and it's sort of reminding people, there's echoes here of the Boer War. So, in order to fix this then, we've got Butler, who is Minister for Education. Just keep an eye on the time because I need to do a live lesson for Year 10 in a second. So Butler's Minister for Education, and he pushes through something called the Education Act of 1944. The Norwood Report of 1943, you don't really need to know a huge amount about. You just need to know that it was hugely criticised because it advocated for selective education, which is anti-Labour. It basically said that kids should have different levels of education depending on their suitability for that type of education, which in theory sounds okay, but it basically means that a lot of middle class people who come from a family that values education, these kids are going to be fine and they're going to go to a really well funded academic school, and kids who are working class who come from a background that don't have a family that values education are going to end up at a crappy school where they're taught vocational skills, and that's going to limit their job opportunities. That always makes me feel quite frustrated because that would have happened to me, because I came from a single parent family living in what was basically poverty, and my parent didn't value education really at all, beyond, I went to school, but they didn't really care what I was doing at school. So if I hadn't gone to a school which literally changed my life, the sort of trajectory of my life would have been wildly different. So I suppose I have a real personal problem with this, but you might think differently to me, which is totally fine. Anyway, so the 1944 Education Act did a couple of things. Raised the school leaving age to 15 with the intention of raising it to 16. Abolished all-age elementary schools and established specialist education for different age ranges. So it's the establishment of like the secondary school. So you've got specialist post-11 education taught by specialist secondary school teachers. So, in theory, this is the education stuff is the good stuff for young people. This is the slightly bad stuff. There's a lot more crime involving young people. We see an increase in what you call juvenile delinquency by 39%. So we've got 39% more crimes committed by young people between 1939 and 1945. This is not necessarily violent crime. So it's not necessarily violent crime at all. It would be things like looting, theft, burglary, or breaking things like blackout, oh my gosh, what do you call it? Blackout requirements. Part of this is because of economic necessity. So I don't want you to think that all young people in the 1940s were terrible thieves, because they weren't. A lot of them are doing it because of economic pressures. So they might be, for example, stealing ration books or stealing food to make sure that they and their families aren't starving to death. But we do see a significant rise in juvenile crime. This challenges the idea that the war was, you know, all sunshine and roses and people pulling together. So it challenges the idea of people's war. Or it challenges the idea of the shared stresses of war. Sorry, I just really need to... Oh my gosh. Right. So, in terms of the regulation of civilian life, then, the 1940s are known as the age of austerity. If something's austere, it means it's very strict, and there's a lot of restrictions. So we've got rationing on luxuries. So that would be things like petrol, civilian use of petrol, clothes and food. And for food, it would be your luxuries. Things like meat, butter, sugar, coffee. So there's like a contraction, as we've already spoken about, there's a contraction of civilian industry. The government wants to restrain consumption. Doesn't want people to be going out and buying really expensive stuff, because the government also wants to reduce imports. So we'll leave it there. Hopefully this was, hopefully it worked. I haven't actually tried it yet, so if this has not recorded me again, I don't know what I'm going to do. Probably scream into the abyss and run into the snow and never come back out again. But what I'm going to do either tomorrow online, or I've got the hiccups now, tomorrow online or tomorrow in person, depending on if we're in or not, I have no idea, is pull the experience of war together. We'll look at the economic experience of war and the social impact of war. So then when I see you in person, definitely next week, we can move on to start thinking about the 1945 election. Have a lovely rest of your day. Be safe, and I will see you at some point soon.